Thank you very much. And
Morning.
I would just like to say a few technical features for all the attendees. Welcome, everyone. During the conference today, you will have the chance to comments on the presentation by using the chat or by saying hello or where are you from. But we invite you to use the Q&A tab that you will find at the bottom of the screen to ask questions to the panelists. Any type of question. Of course, if you can indicate the panelists, it would make our job much easier, and it is much appreciated. We will wait just a couple minutes more to wait for the 10 o'clock sharp. So thank you, everyone. If you have any question, you can start writing them. Right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. We will start in a few minutes. Just a reminder, please use the chat to express any question, technical question, or just to greet everyone, and use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen to ask your question to panelists. I believe that we can officially start, so I would like to give the floor to Talis Tisemkov from the Baltic Studies Center. Talis.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone, and very warm welcome to this SALSA project final webinar. We are very pleased to have you all online and look forward to your participation in the discussion. The SALSA project full name is Small Farms, Small Food Businesses and Sustainable Food Security. And it has a pretty long history. In 2015, the European Commission and the research program Horizon 2020 announced a call on on the topic small farms but global markets, the role of small and family farms in food and sorry, I switched my video on. The small farms but global markets, the role of small and family farms in food and nutrition security. And in response to this call, a consortium of 16 partners from European and African countries and the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization was formed under the coordination of University of Évora. So we prepared a proposal called SALSA, and this proposal was eventually supported by the Commission. And so the consortium started a 4-year project, or rather, in my opinion, it was an inspiring research journey from 2016 until this June 2020. We had an ambitious aim to assess and understand the contribution of small farms and small food businesses to food security, to explore what they produce, how they interact with other food system participants, and importantly, how they can be best supported. And we worked with different methods, went into the fields, met with smallholders and small businesses, spoke to them. We even virtually went into the space, as you saw from introductory video, and looked at small holding areas through satellite images, trying to understand their location, their spatial distribution. We did many things during this project, including in-depth analysis of small farmer situation in 30 regions representing different European areas and African regions as well. We worked together with farmers and policymakers to elaborate on future scenarios and many more. And today we hold the SALSA final webinar. Today, so to speak, is the SALSA Harvest Day, when we want to share with you our main results and recommendations emerging from SALSA research. And therefore, I'm very pleased to introduce to you with the speakers of the first morning session, who will tell you about the main outputs, about the main findings from SALSA. And we will start with the project coordinator, Teresa Pinto Correa. She will, from University of Évora, and Teresa will give an overview of the project outcomes. And we'll have also 3 other speakers, Francesca Galli from University of Pisa, Alejandro Guarin from International Institute for Environment and Development, and Nuno Guiomar from University of Évora. And they will support Teresa, and they will also look at your questions coming from the question sections, and we'll be also supported by moderators who will look into your questions and organize. Moderators Maria and Sandra, they will organize and then forward your questions to respective speakers. And you are very welcome to put questions, to ask questions in the question and answer section. So I'm very pleased now to give floor to Teresa Pinto Correa to introduce with the SALSA the findings. Please, Teresa.
Thank you very much, Talis. Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here and to be presenting the SALSA results. I'm trying to get my video on, but I'm not allowed it yet. I will share my screen, so I have a presentation. Hopefully it will work. Yeah, it's there. I hope you are seeing my screen and that you are listening to me. Okay. Okay, so I will present you SALSA. this project, as Thalis was talking about. And I would like to say that we have these 16 partners in Europe and Africa, and we analyzed 19 countries. So it was very spread across Europe, with some examples in Africa to complement the analysis. The regions selected are 25 regions in Europe and 5 regions in Africa. In Europe, what we did was to select the regions according to a typology we make. And the typology we made considering the importance of small farms, both in the territorial area, so in the territory, and in the farm sector. So it was a combination of both. And we have therefore different regions, different types of regions, and we have examples of these regions in our sample, so that we can say something about different situations, different regional situations in Europe in relation to small farms. In Africa, yes?
Sorry, Teresa, to interrupt you. I would like to ask you to expand your screen, to put the presentation mode. This is the request from some participants. Thanks.
Is it okay like this?
Yes, that's fine. Great.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay. So this was about the regions, about the way we tackle this question. So our question was to understand the role of small farms in sustainable food and nutrition security. And what we did is looking at small farms into the food system, so the role of small farms in the food system, and how through the food system and the food system outcomes, they are contributing to food and nutrition security. So our approach was clearly an approach based on the food system, and therefore we were looking at production, but also at consumption. And here you see, well, it's a big complex scheme, but it's more to show you that the different dimensions of the food system, which contribute to the different dimensions of food and nutrition security, which are normally characterized as food access, stability, utilization, and availability. And we were able to say specifically more about food availability and food stability through our approach looking at the food system. Another specific asset or specific contribution of SALSA was to looking at the territory, so the food system within a region. And we did that because the specific context of the region, with its geography, with the importance of urban areas, with the type of products which are possible to produce, is certainly important to define how the food system works. So we were looking at relations inside the region. We are very much aware that a lot of the food system occurs with relations outside the region, but we were mainly looking at what happens inside, not only in relation to production, but also in relation to consumption. And this made it possible also in a very strong way to interact with our stakeholders, because they know their region, they know the actors in the region, they know the fluxes, they know what happens, what functions and not functions. So we use these schemes, the schemes we are showing, and especially the one in the bottom was the scheme we used to show to our stakeholders what the food system is, and to assess with them the importance of the different fluxes. And therefore, this makes it possible for us to really interact and make this very lively for stakeholders. So one of the main building blocks of SALSA was also this knowledge building together with the communities of practice. We had communities of practice people involved in all the regions. We had more than 500 participants in the different regions. They were representatives of small farms and small food business, but they were also other food chain actors, policymakers, members of the innovation ACIS, of the knowledge and innovation system. So there were different type of people, and what we achieved by this is that we really built some joint interest and learned better to work together. That helped us a lot to collect data and to improve the quality of our analysis. It also raised the SALSA impact, and in some cases, in some regions, we had specific initiatives which were raised or born in SALSA and will continue after SALSA. And it also contributed to the transdisciplinary theory building, which was one of the objectives of SALSA. So to contribute to theory about small farms and their role in the food system. So about work package 2, which is one of the building blocks of SALSA, which is the estimation of the production through satellite images. I will ask my colleague Nuno, who is here close to me, and he will make this part of the presentation. Please remember that if you have any questions, we have short time for this presentation. SALSA is a very big project, So we may forget things, or please remember to put your questions in the chat so that we are able to discuss them with you later on.
Good morning, everyone. In this work package 2, we tried to answer these questions. You can see the first one is to know where the small farms are placed, or that is the spatial distribution of the small plots in each region. The second one, to identify the crop types they produce. And finally, that's the area covered by each crop type that were identified in the previous step. In this process, we faced many difficulties in some regions. We plan to use only spectral data, but for some regions, particularly the ones with high mountain areas, such as the two in Poland, we used also radar data from Sentinel-1. Oh, sorry. After the process of identification of the small plots, which were made with the process of segmentation of the satellite images, we developed a methodology to support the selection of the sample points to collect field data of the crops in each region. In this process, we produced two data sets. One based on the unsupervised classification of the satellite images. We produced for a grid, as you see in this slide, an indicator of the diversity of the spectral information, and another one based on the distance of to the road network. And we maximized the first one and minimized the second one to reduce the efforts of the teams that collected this data in each region. We collect information or data from more than 12,000 points. These points were located in each segment that were produced in the first step of this work package, and part of these points were used to train the models to identify through the satellite images the crops, and 25% of this data set was used to validate the models. It's important to say that in each region, the teams of the partners of this project selected teams to collect the points, but for a large part of our reference regions, a team of the work package 2 visit each area and selected randomly points to produce a value of accuracy, and more or less 85% of the initial points were correctly classified. Then, based on the models we produced using random forests, we produced different maps of the distribution of the crop types in the small plots we identified through the segmentation process. And we compared also the results with official statistics when they are available. Finally, based on this distribution in area, we integrate the data from the work package tree to estimate not only the distribution in area, but also the production capacity in each region, and compared with the regional consumption to assess the capacity of each region to fulfill the regional consumption. And that is the main conclusions. In fact, the images provided by the Sentinel mission, particularly the Sentinel-1 and 2, produce good classification accuracies for the main crop types we have identified in small-scale farming systems. We identified more than 100 crop types in the regions, in areas with mean farm size lower than 5 hectares. A very high percentage of the production at a regional scale is covered can be covered by small farming systems. The overall variability is very high, probably higher than we have expected initially. Regardless the production, the spatial heterogeneity at landscape scale supports by itself the provision of diverse goods and services. And that is one more.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Nuno, for your contribution. And then I will continue with the work we did with interviewing small farms. So besides the Sentinel and the remote sensing work, which was a very, very important part of our empirical effort, we had another very important part, which was interviewing more than 1,000 small farms in all the regions. So a very big sample. Some of the interviews we could not use because of different difficulties. So we had a survey which we could use all the data of almost 900 small farms in the 30 regions. And with that, we produced a typology. And our aim was to produce a typology which really was looking at all the dimensions of small farms. We would have data, a very complete data set, and try to understand what is really differentiating small farms when we don't have, we didn't select the criterion beforehand. So the criteria, the variables which turned up showed to be more important are questions as the turnover, it's very important, the income, the share of income which comes from farm activities, the share of the production which is kept in the household, the mean plot size, so the dimension of the farm, the distance to urban areas shows to be important, the age of the farmer, which is not a surprise, the main reason for farming, this is the way they started farming, the membership or not in comparatives, cooperatives, and use of the certification. So these are the variables which were selected through the analysis as being the most differentiating ones. And this led us to produce this typology, which is a totally new typology of small farms, which has the very interesting characteristic that it can be used, or it encompasses small farm types in Europe and Africa. So it has showed that there is a continuity, and we can find types which are similar in Europe, all over Europe and in Africa. It also has showed that we have to go behind or further than the traditional self-provision or self-consumption and market orientation divide. So normally there is this understanding that some small farms are only working for their own self-consumption and others are market-oriented. What we have seen is that there can be weaker and stronger market integration. So not all farms relate to the market in the same way, but they all relate to the market, more or less, almost all, and they all also have a share which is for self-provisioning. This was very interesting. And then also, when we have this stronger and weaker market integration, we have these first two types, which are the ones normally with lower income, the part-time self-provisioners and the conventional struggles. The part-time self-provisioners seem to be those who choose to be part-time farmers, who have another income and complement their income with what they do in the farm. But they are younger than the conventional strugglers, which are the most poor ones, the ones who have lowest income, and they seem to be there because they cannot be otherwise. So they sell part of what they produce for the market, but they also consume a higher share of what they have, and they have this low income. Then with a stronger market orientation, they have the ones who are better off, but some of them are really mainstream farmers, the conventional entrepreneurs. They relate to the market only with one product, a very mainstream way. They don't earn so much with their farm. And then we have the other ones which are more qualified, which can link to the market, produce or having a higher added value to their products. But the business specialized are in fact the ones who earn more money, apparently. They also are specialized in rather mainstream, but more, they use certification, they are organized in cooperatives, maybe they link directly to the consumer, so they are able to make really good profit from their farm. And the business diversified, they are similar to these ones, but they diversify more. And they happen to be more in Northern Europe, where there is more possibilities of multifunctionality, of selling different products or products and services in the farm. So they also do well. It's very often also an option, a lifestyle, but they are very strongly related to the market. So this is our typology. We have the ones we have more farms, so 30% of the sample is conventional struggles, but we have many farms also in, for instance, the part-time, they are 11%, and the conventional entrepreneurs 26%, and the business specialized 23%. So the business diversified, they are a smaller number, 8%. We also did an analysis of the food system. So we had not through the data we collected in the farms, but also with our communities of practice or stakeholders involved in the stakeholder discussions, we have cumulated knowledge and improved our knowledge of the food system in the different steps, so that at the end we have a rather detailed description of the food system per key product. So we have a food system of olive oil, the food system of wine, of potatoes, of cereals in the different regions, different food products. And we are able to map and to quantify how much is produced by small farms, who do small farms relate to, how they distribute their products, and who is consuming. So as you see in the scheme. So the scheme to your, well, the one with the small icons, the small symbols, is the one we used to discuss at different steps in the process, to discuss with the stakeholders, and the one to the more organized one is the one we use to our own analysis. So what can we say about food systems? We can say that they are, the regional food systems, they are rather differentiated regarding the way, the importance of the production which stays in the region, the production of small farms which stays in the region, and the share of the total regional production which is produced by small farms. For instance, when you see the food system type of D, they are more locally oriented, and a high share of production comes from small farms. And this happens more in Africa, and Eastern Europe has those who are, it's mainly locally oriented with a high share of small farms, or maybe a small share of producing by small farms. And for instance, in Southern Europe, we have more of these systems which are export oriented with high or lower share of small farms. And Northern Europe, it's normally, they are both locally oriented and export oriented, but always with a low share of products from small farms, because normally there's a lower number of small farms in Northern Europe. Yeah, so for many of the products we studied, the first buyer for small farms seems to be very important. And we can see that cooperatives happen to be important, especially there where we have the export oriented, while direct selling at the farm door or selling in direct markets, it's more important where it's more locally oriented. So what is important to say here, to see here, is that the main first buyer of small farms matters. It's their connection to the market, and it really differentiates how they are positioning in the food system. Another issue is that small farm self-provisioning is common across all geographies and products. So it's very rare that a small farm is producing only for the market. Very often they produce for the market and they have for themselves. And that's expected. Direct selling is more common in the food systems which are more locally oriented. So we have a lot of findings, but mainly what we can say there is a very high diversity in small farm profiles and their orientation and role in the food system. So the diversity, it's enormous. We also are very clear about the idea that we have to move behind this subsistence-commercial divide. Most farms are oriented towards the market and for self-provisioning. And that means that we have to look at these two ways of connecting to the food system. Small farms contribute to the different dimensions of food and nutrition security, to food availability, stability, and also access. The first buyer matters, that's what I've said already. And then the link between small farms and small food business is different than what we expected. It doesn't matter so much in terms of quantities, apparently, because small food business buy also outside their local area. But it's very important in terms, for instance, of interactions within the local community, of jobs, I mean the supplementary job for those who work in the farm. So the linkage between small farms and small food business should be further explored. So when we have done the analysis and we have discussed our results and come up with the results, it was the time where we could come back to the jury, which was we had in the beginning, and see how we could improve what we had. And we produced a typology. We know we had selected small farms in the beginning. We had proposed an operative definition, which was by size, even if we knew that size was not enough. But it became very clear that maybe it's better, or it would be better, to think about smallness as a relational concept. So how the small farm are placed in the food system, and size can be when they can be small when the size of one or more of its resources, like land, labor, capital, is a disadvantage in relation to larger farms. But on the other hand, smallness can be very positive because it allows to perform certain functions, such as the direct relation to the consumer, the production of goods and services, which have a limited market, and they can relate to this market, or the possibility to really control and monitor the farm's operations. So they are disadvantages and advantages of being small, and these characteristics need to be considered when we define what a small farm is. Another issue, which I've already mentioned, but it's important to relate to, is that we have an initial conceptual framework looking at this divide of small farms relating to the market and small farms relating only to their household. And we are very clear that it's not just about this. There's different relations, there's different forms of connection, connecting to the market, connecting through reciprocity and through redistribution. So this hybridity in the relations to who is consuming the food, it's very important, and it should not be underestimated. So small farms are really very dynamic, very diverse in the way they relate to the consumption, and a lot of what they are consuming is circulating through informal channels, which we don't know enough about in terms of size, importance, extent. So the connections seem to be very important. Small farms connect with the public support and with welfare. Small farms connect with the markets in different ways, and small farms connect to their local community, and they have somehow a socially embedded connection. These connections were made very clear in SALSA and could be further explored for supporting small farms. We have also tried to assess for the future what will be the needs of small farms, and the needs we will talk also in the second session when we will talk about governance and about policy needs. But it was interesting because this really relates the diversity of small farms even within this diversity, we can identify very specific concerns in relation to what they would need in the future to be able to maintain the very diversified role they have. They are often in trouble to get access to technology and knowledge. It's more easy for a larger farm to acquire the needed technology, for instance, to adapt to climate change in terms of irrigation or something else. They have access to a diversity of value chains, but this diversity needs to be maintained. It's very important that they are not stuck to one type of market because of certification needs or because of some regulatory needs. The policy and regulatory framework very often are not tailored to small farms, and they should be more recognizing this diversity. And then the collective action is very important, and cooperatives are not always promoting collective action. Cooperatives are organizing the relation to the market, but when thinking about or trying to support collective action, it should be more than just cooperation or different than cooperation. So this is what we have as findings in relation to what small farms are, how they relate to the food system, how we can conceptualize them and this relation, and what are their concerns and the concerns of the whole sector, which is worried with small farms or deals with small farms for the future. This is what we are now opening up for a discussion with you, but there will be, after the break, there will be a new session where we will look at governance mechanisms and we will look at policy mechanisms needed for small farms. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look very much forward to the debate now.
Thank you, Teresa. I believe we have a room and time for questions, and I see that in question and answer section there are questions coming in, as well as in the chat. People are exchanging opinions, and if I may ask Maria or Sandra to help to organize these questions and forward them either to Teresa as the main speaker or to Nuno, or we have also Francesca and Alejandro who can try to organize the answers about questions coming in.
Thank you so much. Yes, so we have already started organizing the questions we have received so far. So the first one would go to Francesca, and it is how sustainable food security is defined for the purposes of the project.
Thank you, Maria. This is a very fair question and was perhaps the first question that we had to address in SALSA. So the approach that was taken was considering both the multiple dimensions on food and nutrition security as an outcome of the food system, so considering availability, access, and in a first stage, utilization dimensions, but particularly the conceptual framework that was adopted considers the multiple territorial levels in which the outcomes actually become effective. That is the farm household level, considered itself as a system, and the region of reference, so the territorial food system of reference, and the global food systems. And we have gathered examples that cover all this diversity. Perhaps I should also add that when we tried to consider consumption and utilization, we were a bit in trouble, because there we realized how complex it is to address this issue. So I would say that our results mainly concern availability and access, and to some extent utilization in terms of more anecdotal evidence that we found, which is also important though, because this perspective of food and nutrition security on the role of small farms draws light not only on food and nutrition security for the farm household, on which we have a huge and long-standing literature, but also on the role of small farms and the diversity that small farms bring to the food systems, and the relations, the territorial relations that small farms establish with multiple environments. So the rural context, but also often the urban areas beyond the economic and value chains in which they are embedded. So I hope this answered. I would like now to address the sustainable objective, on which we had very long discussions in SALSA, but of course we acknowledge the diversity of outcomes beyond food and nutrition security that small farms contribute to. But at some point in the project, we realized that considering the sustainability dimensions beyond the food and nutrition security was perhaps too much for a project. So perhaps Teresa can complement on this point. Thank you.
Yes, can I say something?
Yes,
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, well, I very much agree with what Francesca said. I have not so much to add, that it was a concern from the beginning, but the project was, as you saw, we were really addressing many different types of questions, and we thought, well, by contributing through the identification of this very with a very large sample and with all this evidence about the role of small farms, were contributing also to understand the sustainability of the food system. So it's more through the dimensions of the food system, as Francesca was explaining, but it was an option in the project that we would collect the information, analyze it, and would not be concerned so much during the whole project, during the analytical part, with assessing the sustainability, because it will be too much.
Thank you, Teresa and Francesca. So now I have a question for Teresa, and it is: how was the definition of what a small farm is in terms of structure and economic size defined and validated in the project? And do you think it is a fair definition of what a small farm in all of Europe and Africa is? And should the definition not depend more on the specific contexts?
Mm-hmm. Yes, for sure. The definition needs to be adapted to the context, but that depends very much of why you use the definition for, or what you use the definition for. So one of the first decisions we took also when we were preparing the project was that we should define a functional way to understand what small farmers were from the beginning, so that we could work with that definition and then improve the definition at the end. And that's what we did. So in the beginning, we still discussed it a lot. There was a e-conference specifically about that, so where people from all around the world participated. And we are very much aware that maybe the threshold we defined is not applied, it's not the good one for Africa, and it will not be the good one for other regions. But we needed to have, in the beginning, this statistical analysis, which made it possible for us to differentiate regions and to say there are some regions where you have many small farms, and they are very important. They occupy a lot of area in the region. So the region is mainly a farm region and mainly with small farms, or the region is mainly a forest region, but small farms occupy what is the small areas of farm, or the region is mainly dominated by very large farm, but there are a few small farms who have social roles. So we wanted to differentiate the regions and all over Europe. And for that, because we knew that these territories are very different, and we cannot compare a region where there is mainly small farms occupying the whole territory in Romania with a region, for instance, with a region in Scandinavia where most of the area is forest, and then there is a little bit of farming, which is small farming, or here in southern Portugal where you have mainly very large farm, really estates, and then a very small area of small farms, but small farms have other sectors that the large farms don't cover. So this diversity is a territorial diversity also, and we wanted to disentangle that. And for that, we needed a statistical definition. So we used this one of the 5 actors and 8 economic units. But we also, when we were selecting our sample, this was the guidance, but we were open to the different regions selecting a bit differently. If the farm, for instance, the small farms were very extensive, they would have larger areas of grazing, or they will be small in relation to others, which was much bigger. So we are aware that this is not The size is not a very good definition. We think the very good definition is the question of the relational perspective that we came up at the end as a result of the SALSA, and then the types we have and their position in the food system. So it's more complex than just saying a threshold. We are very much aware of that, but we had to use the threshold to start our analysis and to have a starting point to differentiate what is smaller from what is bigger. So this is a question which goes on and on and on. What we have contributed is by saying small farms are very diverse. We can identify types of small farms, and we need to understand the context they are in to understand if they are small or not. Yeah, over.
Thank you, Teresa. If any of the other panelists want to complement any of the other answers, please go ahead. I don't need to give you the floor for that. The next question, well, I would also like to comment regarding the questions and answers chat. Some questions are regarding policies. We have a second session which will deal with policies and governance. So please keep those questions for the next session. Okay, the next question is for Nuno. And so people in the chat believe it is the use of satellites is very interesting and powerful. So they would like to know more about how you passed from plots of land to actual farms. I hope you can expand on that.
Hello, thank you for the question. This is a classic one. It's impossible to consider that all the plots belong to a farm. There are farms with high internal diversity, but in the small ones, we identified a relation between the dimension of the plots and the prevalence of small farms. And what we in fact analyzed were the small plots. It's impossible to have a limit for farms only based on satellite data. For that, we need cadastral data. But we found strong relations and linear relations between the distribution of the small plots and the prevalence of small farms in that areas.
Thank you, Nuno. Okay, the next question is for Alejandro. Is regarding small farm typologies. And they're asking whether we have analyzed the education level of farmers, if that is making a difference in which type of farmer it is. And also asking about certification, where would these young certified farmers find themselves in which type? And are small farm types linked to specific products at different degrees of specialization? If you could expand on that, also maybe Teresa wants to comment on this question. Thank you.
Yeah, it's Alexandro there. Okay.
No, sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for the good questions. I think on education, yes, that is certainly one of the variables that we use to construct the typologies. And my sense is that you can see education kind of spreading around in two different ways. We have, across the farm types, we seem to have the better educated, and by this, it's a very subjective thing. We mean people with university degrees mostly, or with technical degrees. So people with higher education tend to be among the wealthier farmers or farmers owners of farms that have the highest degrees of revenue. And so that is, we think it's very closely related to a kind of business orientation of the farms, innovation, investments is actually quite related to the question on certification, because those two things, high education and investment in certification, looks to appear simultaneously quite often. So yes, education is an important discriminant of the types. I mean, on a personal basis, I would also kind of just warn, just to say, this is formal education, and I think this is not to make less of the huge amount of experience and knowledge about farming that other farmers that do not have a formal education have. So this is just the question we asked is about formal education. It again seems to be related with greater wealth, and which is not super surprising. Then the other question was about certification, which I just addressed, but just to say, yes, certification was a very clear clustering variable in our typology. It really sets aside a very distinct group of farms, and those farms do tend to be run by the younger farmers on average. On average, also the ones that have a higher degree of university education, and these are farms that seem to have a relatively high revenue and turnover. So I think we call these the diversified buyers, I think is what we call them, because they also seem to, those two characteristics seem to feed not into the traditional marketing channels, let's say, which are in the case of our sample usually big wholesalers or big cooperatives, but they seem to sell through different channels, certainly wholesalers, but also directly to consumers or through farmers markets or to processors. So they seem to have a more spread out risk, let's say. And there was a third question, Maria, but I forgot what it was.
Thank you. Yeah, Alejandro, it was, I think you mostly covered. It's regarding the different degrees of specialization and if that affects the different types or even the regional distribution.
Right. Okay. Yes. Yes, I remember. And one about the types of food. So on specialization, again, very, very simply, there seem to be broadly two types going on. We have farms that seem to be very specialized in producing a particular type of crop and selling into very particular chains. And others, like I said, seem to be more diversified. And that actually seems to span both wealthier and poorer farms. So that doesn't seem to be a function of, let's say, the level of farm assets or revenues. We seem to have specialization both in the kind of poorer and on the richer end of the spectrum. And the question about food is very interesting, and I don't think we have a good sense of that. Certainly, it wasn't one of our clustering variables, the type of food that they produce. What we see is some types of farms tend to go more often with certain types of crops. So, for example, we have these older, well-established farmers, relatively wealthy, that are selling into cooperatives, for example. That profile of farmer is very common in the Mediterranean regions, where they're specialized in producing crops for processing or export, such as grapes or olive oil or citrus fruits. So you do see a profile of farm that is more closely associated with certain types of foods, but let's say the food itself was not part of the typology making exercise. That's a real correlation we did later. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alejandro. I'm not sure if Teresa wants to say something. Yes.
Well, very, very little. I think Alexandro explained everything. It's just this question about food, because what we asked is what was consumed in the household. So what the share of the production which was consumed in the household, and then we asked if they consider in the household that they have a diversified food intake or not. So there were some questions, but they didn't the share of the food produced in the farm, which is consumed in the household, was one of the determinant variables, but not the other questions related with food in the household, they were not. So yeah, so that's it didn't appear to be as important as the other ones, which I showed in the presentation. And then I can see in the chat, and I can just reply about this, if there is a question about the urban, maybe we didn't, if they are urban or rural farms. What we interviewed are small farms all over the region. So we have these not 3 regions, they are rather big regions, and we interviewed small farms distributed in all the regions. So some of them are more close to urban areas than others. In our region specifically, we selected regions where there was no very large metropole, because the relations, the food system around urban areas and related to the cities are much more studied than food systems in rural areas. So our regions were not really rural regions, they were regions where there were cities, but not urban regions. And small farms are located all over, but the proximity to an urban setting is one of the differentiating factors. And it was very interesting that the geographic location seems to matter in terms of typologies of farms. Yeah, that is all.
Thank you, Teresa and Alejandro. The next one is for Nuno. And it would be, the question is, what potential do you see for the methodology used in SALSA with the satellite for African regions and also for Europe, but mainly for Africa?
Okay, only to complement the last one. When we finalized the first step, the step related with the segmentation, we have produced a set of indicators based on the distribution of the segments in each region and compared with the distribution of the area covered by farms with different sizes to assess the viability of use that segments as proxies of the prevalence of small farms. When related with the potentiality for of the satellite images for Africa is total, because in Africa we have a lack of data regarding the distribution of crops, of the different land covers through time. And we found we face some difficulties in some areas to identify through the to identify some crops, but I think the final results for the areas in Africa we have analyzed are pretty good and show that potentiality to reduce this lack of data. In Europe, I think that it's time to use and abuse the data that are available every day to produce annually different types of data sets, including data sets related with intensity of land use and rotativity of crops to assess the overall distribution of or availability of the different products across Europe and and across the year. I think now it's time to use these available data that have great potential to produce different types of data sets and products. That is.
Thank you, Nuno. I'm not sure if we have time for just one more question or two, so I will go with one last one for Teresa, and it's like, what do you think? So they say that they like a lot what you talked about regarding small farms and farm size as a relational concept and the importance of the context. This goes far beyond the original call, but is highly relevant for policy development. What might follow-up research questions be? So are there any research questions left for the future?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is really interesting. I think that will be, I mean, there's many questions which we couldn't reply. For instance, the question of sustainability. So how will you address the sustainability issue in relation to the food system? So we have evidence that small farms contribute to the diversity of food systems and to more locally based or regionally based food system, and they contribute significantly. And they also contribute to their own food consumption and to the food consumption of those who are close to, and that is a measure also of resilience and of sustainability. This is food which is not going out and have a very big ecological footprint. But exactly how can we produce, how small farms can better be sustainable in all dimensions of sustainability for the future? And how can they be supported in their specific characteristics, so not making them mainstream and in the same pathways as large farms? This is very important. And I think we have opened the door. We have a lot of evidence, but we will need more evidence. Also, we would need to continue on this, on the relation to the satellite, to explore more the monitoring capacity and the capacity to see what are the crops which really are being able to maintain. Can we maintain the diversity with the satellite? We have the vision of the plots, but we also have the vision of the landscape scale. So the contribution to public goods like diversity at the landscape level, which contributes to pest control, to water cycle, to the soil issue. This monitoring of what happens in the dynamics. We have the instruments, we know it can be done, but we have not been able to address it. Yeah, and then I think there should be more investment in developing case studies and following these case studies where different out-of-the-box policy tools are experimented, like policy tools addressing collective action, addressing direct relations to the market, payments by results. For instance, if small farms can keep all these connections and can keep a diversified farm, can they be paid by that through public funding? So the results or the new types of mechanisms, of supporting mechanisms, could be really important to understand. And maybe this cannot be done at a larger scale, but then at the case study level as pilot. Wow. I mean, I think there are really many questions which would need to be addressed, but for policy proposals, I can see these ones. Thank you very much. Very interesting question.
Thank you, Teresa. And thank you everyone for all the questions you have been raising. We're sorry we don't have time to answer them all, but we will collect them and answer them and publish them in our website. I hope that that is okay with all of you. And I will pass the floor back to Thalis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for your facilitation, and many thanks to the participants for their questions, and utmost thanks to Teresa, Francesca, Alejandro, Nuno for your presentation and answers. Just in a couple of minutes time, trying to summarize according to what I understand and looking into questions and answers, and SALSA was about contribution and role of small farms and small food business. And as Teresa showed in her presentation and also in answers, these farms really contribute to all the dimensions of food and nutrition security, availability, access, utilization, and stability. And then what Nuno showed through satellite images and analyses, and also questions raised from the participants. Interestingly, those satellite images showed in a way a kind of truth which a political eye often maybe neglects, that those farms are present and in most of the regions, and they are differently distributed, but we see them from satellites, but not so much maybe maybe politically, but also we do try to see them and appreciate politically. And then there's specific lens from the SALSA was regional food system maps and how they interact with other participants in food system. So one of the question was on the context. So how do we understand small farms in their context? And here the SALSA contribution through the regional food systems. This is something we should pay attention to, and not least also in the COVID situation. And then a lot of questions and on political aspects and capacities, and I think we should keep those questions for the second part of the seminar. Really, what is the role of state? What policy can do best? How small farms could get better connected to each other and the markets, etc. So the access aspect, it is indeed also a sort of empowerment. And this leads to my final observation from the discussion on the role of capacities, the questions on education, on farmer skills, and again, the policy questions and capacity questions will be taken up in the second part of the seminar, like role of education, gender, generation as means to empower small farmers, get their better access to market certification technologies. And the final remark, which Teresa brought forward, was that those farms are there, they do exist in the regions, and also in particular contexts, but also this rural, urban, peri-urban dimension, geographic location matters so much. So we have to have a complex vision, complex approach really to understand their situation and then appreciate and support. With that, I would like to end my summary with, again, many thanks to questions and our speakers. And please, please do rejoin, or don't leave. Just we will have a break. We will resume in half an hour at 11:30. At 11:30 Rome time, we have 125 participants. We don't want to lose any of you. Please rejoin, and we'll continue with more kind of policy oriented and farmer capacity oriented discussion in the second half. So thank you, and see you back at 11:30 Rome time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the speakers. As Talis mentioned, we are going to take a small break, and as you can see in on the video, and please stay and answer to a couple questions that we allow you to reply. Sorry. Please, I launched a poll. You should be able to see it. Thank you everyone for answering to the poll. As you see, the correct answer was more than 70%. Well done, the majority of you. And as Thalis mentioned, we will be back in less than 20 minutes. So, you can have a coffee break and be back. We will be right back as well. For those of you that are still here, we have also another poll. Thank you everyone for participating in the poll. And I'm going to share the results, and you were right. Around 30% of family-led farms are quite common in some parts of Europe. For example, Poland, Portugal, and Italy. Thank you, everyone. We will be back in 10 minutes. So see you soon. Hello, everyone, and welcome back for those who stayed, and welcome for those who just joined. We are going to start in 5 minutes, but for those of you who haven't seen it, I would like to share you, a video of SALSA. So enjoy the view.
So, good morning to everyone. Also by my side, I'm Gianluca Brunori. I am a professor of food policy at Pisa University, and I will introduce this second session of the SALSA final conference. In the first session, we got an overview of the main findings. And in this session, we wish to highlight the aspects that may strengthen the contribution of small farming to food security and nutrition. We have said before that the relational dimension is crucial in understanding small farming. And then in the first presentation, we will address the theme of governance, showing how farmers interact with other actors of the food system to organize their business and how different patterns of interaction affects contribution to food and nutrition security. Another key dimension is the policy dimension. And with the second presentation, we will address the issue of policies, looking to how it is possible to create enabling conditions for small farmers as drivers of food and nutrition security. But then, as a third step, we couldn't avoid considering the specificity of the situation in which we are after the coronavirus. So we have asked to give a presentation on the role of small farming in the new context characterized by the coronavirus. Let me introduce the speakers. The first one will be Leanne Sutherland, senior researcher working in the Social Economic Geographical Science Group of Hutton Institutes in Scotland. She was raised in a family farm in Canada, and she is an interdisciplinary social scientist with a background in European agrarian development, human environment relations, and farm level decision making. Then we will have Mark Regdman, who is the co-owner and director of High Layer Consulting. He has 30 years of experience in research, consultancy, teaching and training activity in agriculture, rural development, and environment. And then Sofia Davidova is professor of European agricultural policy. Sofia Davidova has participated in a range of international research projects, and since 1989, she has been involved in several activities also with international institutions. But first, let me introduce Nevena Alexandrova from FAO, who will give the opening remarks for this second session. So please, Nevena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My name is Nevena Alexandrova Stefanova. I am Agriculture Extension Officer at the Research and Extension Unit at FAO headquarters. And I have the pleasure and the privilege to co-coordinate the SALSA Work Package 7 on communication and visibility together with the Baltic Study Center. Hence, at the start of this pivotal session dedicated to policy and governance issues for small farms and small businesses, I would like to make a few remarks from agricultural development perspective that hopefully will resonate further in our common efforts to do outreach for strengthening the voice of small farms in the debate of food and nutritional security, and also to bring a societal change in the perception of the role of smallholder farms and food and nutritional security. My first message would be that small farms and food businesses deserve an increased attention. For many years, smallholders and small businesses have too often been neglected by policymakers, investors, and services, including IT solution providers recently, with the justification that smallholders produce food for themselves, while commercial farms produce food to feed the world. Whether this statement is justified or not, actually, SALSA brought some light on and clarifications on that, as we have heard in the morning. But let's see some figures. According to the figures, we cannot neglect smallholder farms and businesses. There are 500 million smallholder farms with 2.5 billion smallholder farmers or food businesses that work full part-time in the agriculture sector and that are producing up to 80% of our food. In Europe, about 10 million farms are family farms, and 45% of those 10 million are actually small farms with an aging farmer profile. While for instance, in Africa, we have the opposite trend. However, those farmers have some issues. They are vulnerable 80% of the extreme poor live in rural areas, and half of them are under 18 years old. And actually, SALSA increased this evidence-based and also shed light on the diversity and typology of smallholders and businesses, and their different needs that have to be addressed in a targeted manner by policymakers, investors, and also advisory services, for instance. My second outreach message is that small farms and food businesses are part of the solution of the food and nutrition security, and the challenges that, against the background of the constantly eroding resource base, climate change, and recently COVID-19, the agriculture production still needs to increase by 60% worldwide and double in developing countries by 2050, and it has to increase in a sustainable manner. And this is just the first step of the food system. So to realize its potential, agriculture needs to change dramatically, and small farmers need to be critical agents in this transformation. And actually, SALSA proposed some options, methods, and tools. For instance, the regional food system map for sustainable food transformation that involves smallholders and small businesses. My next message is that small farms and food businesses obviously cannot unlock their potential by themselves, and they do require enabling environment translated into access to knowledge, innovations, technologies, access to markets, access to capital, advisory services, land in some regions, and also improved rural infrastructure and rural image in order to try to reverse the out-migration from the rural areas. So for all that, we need a coherent and evidence policy approach and targeted investments, for instance, to enable farmers to innovate, to participate in food systems. The territorial aspects need to be addressed, together with strengthening the cooperation among farmers and partnerships. For all this, you will hear in a moment by the other speakers in the session. And my last message is about that small farms and food businesses actually need capacities, advocacy, and outreach, and this should be done in parallel or even prior the policy processes and policy measures to take place. In capacities, we talk about innovations capacities that can be technical but also functional capacities, advocacy by farmer organizations, but also non-farmer networking, for instance, in community of practices. And most importantly, I would like to emphasize on the need of societal support, that it's a broader communication and outreach in order that we would be able to understand better the needs of smallholders and support them. So to prepare the society to recognize the role of those smallholders and also engage in the strengthening of their voice, Work Package 7 prepared many products and used many channels to reach different audiences. So this is an example in which we reached a very high-level audience of the community of food, World Food Security during an event in October last year. However, the project intervened also in a grassroots level and many others. Here you can see some examples of our products, again targeted to reach very different audiences: youth, women, policymakers, services, and so on, and providing a solid evidence-based to help advocacy and strengthening the voice of smallholders. Here you can see a variety of channels that have been used. Websites, Twitter, social media, email conferences, and many others. So with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. And I would like also to bring into your focus also some products that FAO is developing. FAO is engaged in many products actually, and for smallholders, but just a few of them. The FAO Tech is a platform for practices and technologies dedicated to smallholders that has currently over 900 practices and technologies that are validated and put into practice. And also an example from the region for Europe and Central Asia, the office in Budapest is running a regional initiative on the empowerment of smallholders, and SALSA actually also cooperate with this. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nevena. And then now we can start with the speakers on governance, policy, and the situation post-COVID. But first, I would like to remind all participants that in order to set questions, they should use the question and answer tool they have. And we will have moderators as in the first panel. In this case, the head moderator will be Dionisio Ortiz Miranda, who is professor at the University of Valencia, supported by Maria Rivera and Arlindo Fortes. And the speakers will respond to your question moderated by them. So please, Leanne, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Governance is a very broad topic. It refers to the informal norms and regulations that influence society, but also the formal ones. And so we're looking at a whole array of things, from how you interact normally with your family and your neighbors and the expectations that they have of normal behavior, right through to regulations, public policies, associations, cooperatives, farming associations, in this case, financial realities, by which we mean commodity markets or access to subsidies or credit that impact on small farms and small food businesses. In SALSA, we're looking particularly at governance in terms of enabling conditions. It may seem fairly obvious to you that for a small farm or a small food business to contribute to food and nutrition security, they do it through a regional or national food system in a lot of cases. And to do that, they need to exist. What we mean by that is that a small farm needs to have land, for instance, it needs to have labor, and it needs to have capital. And there are a range of social conditions that influence access to those things. It's the same thing with production. So if we're looking at a small scale farm or a small food business, what is it that enables them or disables them from producing? So we know from the SALSA statistics, for example, that small scale farms in particular could produce more by and large. That's what the majority of the participants in our survey said. And so why they aren't doing that has a lot of reasons behind it, some of which we're going to talk about today. These small farms and small food businesses then need to market what they produce. We've heard from Teresa this morning that the primary contribution at present of small scale farms and small food businesses to food security is actually in the area of self-provisioning. So they consume a lot of what they produce themselves, and that's really important. But if we want them to contribute more to regional and national food systems, and so broader food security at regional and national level, then we need them to be able to market what it is they do. So I've organized my presentation today along these three lines, and Mark's going to follow that on for you when he talks about the policy recommendations in the presentation that comes next. I'm also going to be talking a fair bit about gender today. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, gender is a demographic. What is that actually doing in a discussion of governance? But it actually has quite a lot to do with governance, because what you find is that when you look at each of those three areas, there's actually a gender difference in terms of which gender has access to more of which kinds of resources to start a farm, to produce on that farm, and then to market from that farm. Gender is also particularly important in SALSA because we know that women are more likely to lead smaller scale farms than larger scale farms. And I need to be clear about that because they're still in the minority across the board. But where you see women leading farms, they are much more likely to be small scale farms than larger farms. And I will get into that more later. So I'm a firm believer in putting the key messages up front. So these are the 5 key messages that I have for you today. I'm going to take you through them briefly right now, and then I'm going to take you through them in more detail in relation to those 3 areas that I have just pointed out. So the first message that I really want to get across to you today is that helping women helps new entrants, and helping new entrants coming into farming is also going to be beneficial for women. And the reason for that is that there's very good evidence that newcomers into farming are more likely to be women than is characteristic of the current farming population. So what we mean by that is not that the majority of new entrants are women, but that there are more women represented among new entrants to farming than there are typically within agriculture at present. And there's a lot of issues around, reporting that accurately, because statistics tend to report one farmer when typically farms are run by families. But there is a general principle here that works to facilitate more women to become active and women to become visible is going to be helpful for new entrants and vice versa. There's also a particular issue in relation to access to advice on small-scale farms in particular, and there's a lot of reasons for that. That has to do with the privatization of advisory services and new entrants, small-scale farms' ability to actually afford those services, but also kind of other contributing effects that small-scale farms, for instance, are more likely to be in remote areas where it's less profitable to run an advisory service business, and similarly located on marginal land. Cooperation is a big theme, and I know Mark's going to pick that up next in what he talks about, that co-ops can be incredibly enabling to help farmers on small-scale farms deal with those kind of economies of scale issues that they just don't have by definition. But co-ops aren't equally available across Europe or Africa. Food quality and safety regulations are important, but they can also be big barriers for small-scale farmers because they haven't got the resources necessarily to meet those regulations, whether it's putting an extra sink into the processing facilities, spending the time on the advisor to fill out the form, for instance. So there's a lot of things that economies of scale influence in terms of how small farms behave. The last message that I really want to bring home to you today is about the role of women on farms and how it tends to be underreported in statistics. And that's quite a problem because we don't know then whether women are being disproportionately benefited or disadvantaged in relation to particularly the government programs that get put in place. There are lots of NGOs and government organizations working in Africa that have targeted gender programs, but it tends to be much less recognized in the European context, but we still think it's important. So to get into these issues in a bit more detail, let's talk first about the existence of small-scale farms. It probably seems fairly obvious, like as I say, you need access to land. But this is particularly an issue in Africa where it's linked to access to credit. And so the small-scale farms that we're talking about in SALSA, which are primarily less than 5 hectares, are very small in European standards, particularly in Northern Europe. So that's not typically a farm size that you're going to be able to get a mortgage on, or at least not for very much money, or to be able to leverage a lot of credit. But actually that can be hugely important in Africa. So if you don't have secure access to this land, particularly if you don't own it, it can be a particular issue in accessing credit, which then reduces your ability to invest in the inputs that you need or the labor that you need to actually produce and then go on to market. In Europe, there's a common agricultural policy, and there's a differential in which countries have access for small-scale farms to targeted subsidies for them. But even where they are available, the transaction cost can be pretty high in comparison to the amount of money that they're going to be able to get from that. We're not just talking about the direct payments here, we're also talking about access to rural development funding. So subsidies to plant trees or diversify your farm business often require quite detailed paperwork that you would need to pay someone to help you with. And that's often something that small-scale farms either can't afford or can't justify on the basis of what they're likely to earn back from it. To bring in the gender angle on that, access to land is it's the single largest barrier to new entrants in Europe, and that's well recognized. But we also know that women are very much less likely to inherit land in both Europe and Africa. In Europe, that's cultural. There are no legal barriers to women inheriting land, but there's a very strong cultural norm of passing the farm on to a son. It's one of the reasons that women are much more likely to lead a small-scale farm if they lead a farm at all, and it's because they've had to come into the sector on the basis of their own resources, which, given the size of most commercial farms in Europe, means that they've only been able to afford a small one. It's also an important issue in Africa in terms of secure access to land and how land gets passed through families and food security at that family level. So the message, as I said at the beginning then, is that helping women and helping new entrants are often very similar things and interrelated in terms of who gets to set up farms. There's also a big issue in terms of inheritance, that there's quite a lot of non-commercial farming that happens in Europe, particularly in Northern Europe. And this may or may not happen on farms that have been inherited. One of the issues with small-scale farming is that when these farms are inherited, they quite often have a very strong value to that family, but not necessarily very much commercial value, because by definition, they're not very big. And so what that means is that families tend to hold on to that land for sentimental reasons and potentially underuse it or even not utilize it at all. So use it as a summer home, for instance, or a place to gather once in a while. And that really becomes a big blocker for new entrants who are trying to get into the sector to find a piece of land that they can actually access to start a farm. Moving into the next one, which is looking at production. So as you can imagine, on small-scale farms across Europe and Africa, informal and family labor is very important. And cooperatives can be a huge asset in terms of dealing with economies of scale. So enabling small-scale farmers to group together means that they can produce together, they can buy inputs together in bulk, making them less expensive, and as I will get to in a minute, they can also market together and overcome the barriers to getting into the marketplace by producing a more secure and substantial contribution to the larger food systems. But they're not equally available across Europe or Africa. And there are some areas, particularly in Eastern Europe, where there's a strong cultural barrier to participating in cooperatives. They can have an effect of just making farmers reluctant to cooperate with each other, even if it might appear economically to be in their best interests. Something that we found in SALSA, and we've also found in other Horizon projects, so AgriLink, for instance, but also the FP7 project ProAcus, is that small-scale farms have disproportionately limited access to agricultural advisory services. And a lot of that, as I mentioned earlier, has to do with the privatization of advisory services, particularly in Europe. In both Europe and Africa, affording access to advice can be particularly difficult on small-scale farms because they don't tend to generate a lot of revenue. So it can be very difficult at a household level to justify then paying for advice. It also doesn't help that these small-scale farms tend to be located in these remote regions or areas where there is less productive agriculture, because again, it's either more difficult for that commercial advisory service to reach them, or those small-scale farms have less ability to actually pay for those services. The gender perspective on this in Africa is that female-led farms in Africa appear to be less productive. And this has less to do with the size of their farms, although they also tend to be smaller, than it has to do with the fact that women in both Europe and Africa tend to be more responsible for reproductive labor, by which we mean they are busy taking care of the kids. So by definition, they then have less time to spend on actually working on their farm holdings. But there are also issues in relation to lack of education in Africa in particular. Actually, in Europe, women on farms tend to be more highly educated than men on farms, so that's an interesting difference. But women in Africa also struggle with access to inputs and credit that would enable them to invest in their farms. In both Europe and Africa, women tend to be less recognized in farming organizations, so they're less likely to be elected to leadership positions, which gives them their issues and concerns less of a voice and makes them less visible in policy discussions. Now, interestingly, well, perhaps not so interestingly or surprisingly, and when you're looking at organizations that particularly target small-scale farming, so small-scale farmer organizations like the Crafting Federation in Scotland, for instance, where I work, you actually are seeing a much more representative number of women, or even more women than men, turning up in the leadership. And that's a reflection of how women are much more involved in small-scale farming. It tends to be more of a all-hands-on-deck approach, but you're not seeing that in Africa. Similarly, in the African countries that we looked at, women are less likely to be represented even in smallholding organizations. So the messages, just to reiterate, coming from here is that small-scale farms have limited access to advisory services in many cases, and that enabling cooperation is important but challenging for both production and marketing. So to look at marketing then, as you can imagine, small-scale farms have really benefited from the recent trend towards local and regional foods, because this is something that they can really do well. They can produce a niche commodity, they can do it in a way that's appreciated and valued locally, and they can do it in a value-added way that generates more income from their smaller piece of land. The challenge for small-scale farmers is that these food quality and safety regulations tend to be oriented towards larger businesses. So I said at the beginning, it can be difficult for them to afford that new sink or to fill out the paperwork to actually get access to these programs. And again, this is where cooperatives can help. They can give the kind of volume that small food businesses in particular need in order to be able to market their product on a year-round basis and provide a steady stream of it to their client base. I expect that Teresa said this morning, but I think it's worth reiterating here that we didn't find quite the connection between small food businesses and small farms that we thought that we would, and that unless the small food business is actually located on the small farm, then often they're not as connected as you might think. And the reason for that is that these small food businesses, even though they are small, tend to need more input and a larger volume of product coming to them on a regular basis than it's possible for individual small-scale farms to produce. The gender perspective on this is that women are more likely to be involved in diversification and value-added processing in both Europe and Africa. And so for what that means is the same thing as the new entrant equation that we did earlier. So policies that Mark may talk about later, for instance, that are beneficial to value-added processing and diversification, so working with these food quality regulations, for instance, are disproportionately going to advantage women and help them become more visible in the agricultural sector. We also wanted to note, and this is probably well known to those of you in the audience, but there are actually some marketing channels in the African cases that we looked at where women are actually excluded for very strong cultural or in some cases legal reasons. So that's our fourth key message about food quality and safety regulations, which you'll probably have noticed, although I've talked about women quite a lot in the presentation, that I haven't gotten on to the last point yet. So I'm going to speak about that now, just briefly. So this is a graph. It doesn't come from SALSA, it comes from Eurostat, and it looks at the number of female-led farms across the European Union member states. And so what you'll see is that there's a huge variation. So we have to be careful when we're talking about women in agriculture to recognize that there are huge national and regional variations as well. So what the graph shows is that in countries like Lithuania and Latvia, for instance, women actually quite commonly lead farms. They're almost 50%. Whereas when you look at countries which frankly have some of the larger farms, Germany and Denmark, for instance, it's actually below 10%. Now, this isn't broken down by size because there aren't graphs of that easily available. And that's one of the points that we wanted to make, is that there's a real issue in both the African countries that we looked at and in Europe more broadly in finding gender disaggregated data. The European Commission has done several reports on gender dynamics in agriculture, particularly looking at the role of women in agriculture. It's certainly true that the role of women in agriculture is very well recognized in Africa. But one of the things we were disconcerted to find in SALSA was just how little reporting is actually done within agriculture about gender. And there appears to be almost an active failure to report gender disaggregated data in relation to rural development programs, for instance. Now, this isn't uniform across Europe. There are countries like Spain that are actually leading the charge and spending targeted effort on enabling female entrepreneurship and women in agriculture, but there are also quite a lot of countries who appear to be kind of sweeping this under the bush. They don't really look at women in agriculture particularly. Apologies, I went the wrong direction there, because what I wanted to bring up was this idea of invisible farmers. And the problem with not recognizing gender differences in agriculture is that you end up with invisible farmers. So the role of women becomes underreported and unrecognized, and it becomes normalized that women are somehow less active in agriculture than men are. And that's one of the things that we wanted to challenge, or I was particularly keen to emphasize in the presentation today, is that when you're looking at how government money is spent and European Commission funding, and that is increasingly scrutinized, it's important to think about, is this actually challenging the gender barriers in agriculture in Europe, or is it actually reinforcing them? By not actively thinking about how women and men benefit differently from the different programs, are we actually making women less visible and ensuring that the status quo continues? So I'm going to leave you with that thought and return to my 5 key messages that I've put before you today. So those are that helping women in agriculture will also help new entrants and vice versa, that there is a clear issue on access to advisory services. Enabling cooperation appears to be a very positive way forward, but it's going to be tricky in some European countries. There are issues with food quality and safety regulations that, if we deal with, can make a big difference for both enabling women and enabling small-scale farms in particular to contribute to our regional and national food systems, and that there are very important roles for women on small-scale farms and in agriculture more generally, but underreporting is a problem. As you can imagine, I've thrown a lot of information at you today. There is a lot more available through the SALSA website and the different publications that we've produced, and do feel free to ask questions or tweet. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. Very clear presentation with some very clear and neat messages. But now we have to see how these messages can be turned into policies. And then it's the turn of Mark Redman. Mark, the floor is yours.
Hello everybody, my name is Mark Redmond. I'm going to give a brief overview now of the general policy recommendations arising from the SALSA project. The presentation encompasses basically 5 policy briefs that we produced jointly between ourselves, Highclere Consulting, Calderetti, University of Evora and FAO. The policy links are available at this link. There's a general overview policy brief plus 4 macro-regional briefs covering Africa, Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, and Southern Europe. The concept of macro-regions was a way in which we basically addressed the 19 countries and 30 reference regions that we were working in, and this is a simple breakdown showing the distribution of countries between macro-regions. Now, the reference regions, not surprisingly, encompassed a huge diversity of context. And I'd like now just to give a very brief, quick snapshot of the reference regions of some reference regions in Europe. And these are photos from a range of reference regions, photos that we took whilst we were doing the field work, which I think do give a rather nice flavor of who we met, where we met them, what they were doing, and their day-to-day business, where they live, where they used to live, and just a few faces to finish with. Now, in terms of developing the policy recommendations, we obviously built upon the evidence base that was accumulated from the 30 reference regions. We applied a SWOT analysis and needs assessment at national level working with our national experts. We aggregated the needs that came out of that SWOT, and we validated them in a series of 4 macro-regional workshops. We then enriched those outcomes with further input from other parts of the project, particularly narrative and observation coming out of the fieldwork. We crafted that into hopefully meaningful recommendations which are relevant in the contemporary policy context of the different partners, and we produced a set of colourful and easy to read brochures. Now, in terms of formulating the policy recommendations, we worked within the broad framework of enabling conditions that my colleague Leanne has previously introduced. Enabling conditions for small farmers to exist, to produce, and to market. And into that framework, we then put the sort of aggregated clusters of needs that we had identified. And these are not prioritized, but they are aggregated and then distributed here. Under exist, people and communities, better connectivity and infrastructure. Now, clearly, if we want small farms to continue making a contribution to our regional food systems, then we need to encourage them to remain in, and in many cases, return to our rural areas. We need to address issues such as rural depopulation, and especially the loss of young people. Generational renewal and new entrants are also a major issue in many countries. Therefore, in order to make rural areas attractive places to live, we need to invest in people, we need to invest in communities. This includes hard investment in roads, rural services, basic utilities, internet accessibility, but also soft investment in leadership skills and community development. Now, leading on from this, of course, there's no use to encourage small farmers to stay in our rural areas if they don't have access to land. Now, depending upon different national and regional contexts, there are a variety of needs associated with land, ranging from improved access for new entrants, to greater security of tenure, to countering the negative effects of land grabbing that we unfortunately observe in many countries. And in specific cases, there's also the need to enhance land productivity as an essential first step towards household or regional food security and any greater long-term vision of market integration. Now, linked to land and productivity, of course, is the need for the various production factors used by small farms to be available and to be of good quality, ranging from basic inputs such as affordable, good quality seed, to appropriate small-scale machinery and other technologies, to reliable, skilled labor, whether it's family labor or employed. At the same time, of course, small farmers are especially vulnerable to the negative impacts of climate change, including prolonged water shortage, excess weather events, the new emergence of pests and diseases, and various soil degradation processes. Access to finance is a perennial problem for small-scale farmers. It's a well-documented issue, maybe less well acknowledged of the simple practical challenges of what we call fiscalization, faced particularly by those smaller scale producers that have traditionally traded informally, but now wish to commercialize, to demonstrate financial viability, to make themselves visible to the relevant authorities, and to apply for financial support. Now, of course, in order to continue delivering food and nutrition security at a regional level, small farmers need to be enabled with more alternative, higher value-added supply chains that connect them directly to consumers. In the European context especially, there's growing interest in short supply chains, niche products, local produce labels, and various other forms of branding that can be taken advantage of by small farmers. In the African context, we also observed the need for more structured supply chains. And then finally, it's widely acknowledged that small farms in Europe have been greatly disadvantaged in recent years by the trend towards the privatization of national and regional farm advisory services and the fragmentation of these advisory services, particularly in certain countries. A lack of advisory services is also a problem observed in many regions. Now, public advisory systems, together with associated mechanisms for facilitating knowledge exchange and fostering innovation, are of course essential needs for building the capacity of small farms to enhance their productivity and profitability. Now, in terms of available policy instruments and tools, we have a vast range available: regulatory, financial support tools, all the tools related to advisory, knowledge exchange and innovation, and also, let's not forget, the projects also remain a very useful policy intervention. Now, some existing policy instruments are already fit for purpose to address the needs of small farms. Other existing policies need some improvement or enhancement, but also some new policy tools are also needed. At the same time, also, we need to be putting greater emphasis upon optimizing the policy mix. In terms of multi-level policy making and governance, we can talk at EU, national, regional, or local. We certainly tend to favor the more regional and local in the context of our work in SALSA. There's also great diversity of target groups and actors, individual farmers and farming households, groups of farmers, rural communities or communities of farmers, small food businesses, and of course, a whole range of relevant authorities, organizations, and networks. Taking into account and keeping in mind, of course, that not all small farms or farming households are actually policy receptive. So it may well be that the best way to approach them is on a community level rather than an individual level. Now, in terms of our broad policy recommendations to exist, for small farmers to exist, we believe very much that the concept of community-led development is very relevant in this context. CLLD, as it's known, provides the possibility for the multi-funding of bottom-up public-private partnerships, so-called local action groups, which implement local development strategies based on clearly defined sub-regional territories. And small farms can be a legitimate or are a legitimate focus of those local development strategies. This approach is very flexible, potentially very effective at enhancing the quality of life at local level, including investment in infrastructure and local services. Strong focus on cooperation and innovation. The implementation procedures are improving. And also within this concept, within this area, there's also a new, lighter concept of smart villages, which is extremely interesting, which is embracing both social innovation and digital transition at a level closer to the village rather than the region. In terms of policy recommendations for small farmers to continue producing, we see a need to refresh and renew small-scale production. There's clearly a fundamental need to engage more young people in small farming. This involves targeted support for agricultural education, generational renewal, and new entrants. New entrants according to clearly defined criteria appropriate to the local context. Also, the scope to use multiple approaches where feasible, and there are clearly some issues here, to facilitate access to land, ranging from classical approaches such as modification of taxation through to more innovative land mobility schemes. Also, there's clearly potential to remove what are clearly a set of unnecessary barriers which are blocking finance to access to finance, including simplification of application procedures, issues of collateral, etc., etc. Also, a lot of scope now for adapting digital technologies to the specific needs of small farmers, whether this is needs related to production or, of course, also needs related to connection with the market, which we'll address in a minute. But overall, we highly recommend the investment of public money in building the resilience and adaptive capacity of small farms to climate change. Climate change consistently emerged across all of the reference regions as a major issue. And this investment in public money can range from micro-irrigation at a very, very local level through, of course, to national risk management schemes. In terms of enabling conditions to market, we see a suite of potential policy tools that could be used to build closer and stronger connections with consumers. As a baseline, flexible but robust interpretation and implementation of food safety and hygiene standards is essential. There's a lot of scope to develop more better strategies for market integration of small-scale producers and processors. There's a lot of existing very successful strategies, but there's also potential scope for more. But overall, of course, to continue investing in and fostering this culture of cooperation at all levels and dimensions of the small farm sector, both between farmers, within value chains, across relevant sectors. And overall, whilst being creative and innovative also to recognize that there is a need to apply regulation where necessary. There are certain things that need to be defined, whether it's definitions of short supply chains in certain contexts, or the definition of things such as agri-food supply chain agreements, which are increasingly popular in Italy. And of course, a major policy intervention would be a range of actions relating to unlocking the potential of public procurement. Now, all of that needs to be built on the foundation of a stronger agricultural knowledge and innovation system for small farmers. This is something of a jargon term, but it's a very useful concept because it implies an interconnection between, particularly for small farmers, publicly funded advisory systems at the local level with a full range of relevant knowledge and competencies to support small farms, appropriate education, training and training courses and facilities for small farms, the development again of appropriate advisory tools for small farms, dedicated demonstration farms, and very importantly, the facilitation of peer-to-peer exchange between small farms, and very interestingly and very importantly, of course, more on-farm research or so-called field labs in order to co-create with researchers, advisors and others innovative solutions to the challenges and opportunities faced by small farms. As I say, that was a very brief overview, and hopefully there'll be some questions that arise from it. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mark. And then we go to the last speaker, Sofia Davidova. Please, Sofia.
Thank you. What I'll try to do today is to give you some ideas about the situation of small farmers during the current COVID pandemic. I will also use 2 case studies which show how small farmers react and affected by shocks. So what I'll cover, some SWOT analysis of small farmers, because I think some of their typical weaknesses may not be strengths during the pandemic. Some specific issues in current time, and then results from 2 case studies with smallholders, one in Bulgaria and one in Ukraine. It is very well known that even in so-called normal times, smallholders are exposed to many risks. And this is the risk web trapping smallholders. None of these risks has disappeared, but now we have on the top this public health risk of the virus COVID-19. We have seen over the years many SWOT analyses, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for small farmers. Now, let's see their normal strengths. It's resilience to shock, is food security because they produce their own food. It is diversified output that gives the opportunity to cover several dietary needs, absorption, very flexible absorption of family labor, and mitigation of rural poverty. Now, some of the typical weaknesses are lack of integration in the globalized, in the value chain, full reliance on family labor, no hard labor, almost none, and often geographical remotenesses. Now, I put this in red for particular reason, because I think these are now their strengths. They are not exposed to the typical disruption of the value chain. They are not exposed to the typical lack of mobility of workers, migrant workers necessary for agriculture, and somehow in several communities, they are really isolated. From the point of view of opportunities, there are traditional community norms in rural areas, which are about self-support. And they have traditional self-support of extended family. Their food is normally locally produced. It doesn't come from far away. And they have mutual exchange of labor, probably paid in kind between neighbors. It does not mean that the situation is pink. There are many threats. There are threats of loss of livelihoods, of lost labor, because some families might be exposed to infection, to death, increase inequality, but to some extent, their lack of integration in the globalized food chain is their strength during this unusual time. Now, specific COVID challenges. There is a big debate in literature whether urban or rural areas are more exposed to the virus. From the first point of view, we say, of course, rural areas are sheltered because a lot of open space, no big density of population, but FAO has a very insightful report on 28 April that probably this is true, but rural areas do not have the preparedness, do not have the infrastructure and healthcare development that is necessary for the situation. Plus that the poorest of the poor live mainly in rural areas. The other thing that has been observed clearly is a gendered effect of the pandemic. Now, female women are more exposed, more burdened because they have to school children at home. There is a rise in home violence. And, of course, increased poverty and inequality because people are losing some non-farm jobs. Now, as I promised you, I'll give you some results of 2 case studies of small farmers or rural inhabitants we carried out to see how they reacted to different shocks. And the first one is in Bulgaria, and it is about the shock of financial crisis by the end of 2008-2009. The first thing they told us is that subsistence farming is important in such situation. It acts as a safety net. Also, traditional family support, but one insight that I think is important, it was compassion. That some old households who owned land but could not cultivate it, they gave it for free to other households who were very constrained by the financial crisis to cultivate. The social transfers, the government, the public support was a very low level. There were demographic consequences, decreased rate of births, depopulation from young people, from children of rural areas, and also many local businesses went to bankruptcy because of low purchasing power of the population and lack of demand. From the point of view of labor market and employment, farming was used as a labor sink. Whoever was unemployed from other sector came back to farming at least to produce their own food. And it was very important that those who were employed, they had employers' contribution for health insurance. So it was very important for working age population to be employed for access to health. And at the end we asked them, what are your priorities? What are your messages to policymakers. They say job creation, healthcare, level of social transfers, which are negligible now. For Ukraine, this is very recent case study. You are the first audience to hear the results. We use a very useful methodology developed by FAO to see the resilience of household to shocks. And in this case, the shock was the conflict in eastern Ukraine. We try to see the effect of this shock on food security, not only quantity, calorific intake, but also quality, the variety of diet, and to see the resilience, which has several pillars. For example, access to basic services, including health, assets, agricultural, non-agricultural, land, non-land, capacity to adjust depending how many people in working age in the household, what are the sources of income, and how the shock affects traditional social safety network. Now, quickly, some results. Negative effect on food security, both in quantitative and qualitative terms. Negative effect on access to basic services, very important, very strong negative effect on access to healthcare, very important for the current situation. Decrease in productive agricultural assets, land is fine, but non-land assets are affected unfavorably. Partial effect on adaptive capacity, no signs of high unemployment, but decrease of income diversification. And then this links to Bulgarian survey come back to agriculture, so less income sources. And the negative effect was much stronger on typical rural population. What was surprise to us was the deterioration of social safety network. Very big impact on assistance in kind or help in kind or cash. So what households did, they started taking loans. I'm not talking about commercial bank loans, but loans from neighbors, loans from family. And now again, something about policies and future tendencies. Government policies during this pandemic have been a mixed bag. Some countries impose export restrictions. And if you look at UNCTAD information, for example, Vietnam imposed export restrictions for rice. This is anti-farmers policy because this depresses domestic prices and acts against their farmers. Other places, much richer of course, the EU, decided that they will provide support to their farmers. But beyond policies, what can we say about the future? There is a very interesting, very recent article by Bill Kerr about the tendencies beyond the current pandemic. One is that consumers will be much poorer. Being much poorer means that they will go to more staple food. The demand for staple food, non-processed food will increase, which is favorable tendency for small farmers. And the other much broader, overarching possible tendencies is that government may reconsider their globalization of the food chain because this creates vulnerability. And if there is a move to more domestic food chains, this might facilitate small farmers to join because the transaction cost to join this kind of domestic chains Aroa. And at the end, to show my small farmers in action during pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophia. And now it's the time of questions and answer. And I would leave the word to Dionisio for distributing the questions. Please, Dionisio.
Okay. Thank you, Gianluca. Hello to everybody. I hope you hear me. Greetings from the warm Valencia in Spain. I want to thank the panelists for the very interesting presentations that have tackled highly relevant and timely issues that have given rise to a lively debate among the participants, not in the chat, but in the Q&A box, but it doesn't matter. I have been able to follow the questions. And there are a number of questions I would like to pass to the speakers. Unfortunately, we have no time to pass all of them, but as you know, those that are not being responded in this session will be asked and will be retaken later through different channels. So I apologize for this selection. If you agree, I will make a first round of questions to the three panelists. If we have time, we can do a second one. I prefer to make all the questions to the panelists at the same time, so they have even time to prepare something in particular for the last one. For Liane, there are three questions that I think they are addressing topics she has mentioned in her presentation. The first is what can European farmers and policymakers, in any case, what can Europe learn from small African farmers to make agriculture more attractive to young Europeans? Okay, we have this problem in Europe, the lack of new entrants to compensate the exit of older farmers. A second question would be, how can we enable small farmers access to credit? If to what extent we have collected or we have evidences about success stories, good practices to be shared. And thirdly, how can we promote the government or ask the government to have more interest in climate financing small farms that are supposed to be the most vulnerable to the implications of climate change. For Mark, there are some questions that are addressing him very concretely. One is more general, but I want to pass it to Mark, is how do food environments, in particular retail, influence small farmers and their viability? A second one is, do we have proofs about the success of community-led local development experiences, or because you mentioned them in your presentation, or it is an untested recommendation you are providing? And a third one is very specific, is if you can comment on the role of the adoption of the seasonality in procurement in order to unlock the potential of public procurement. Finally, for Sophia, her presentation has been the last one, so I have not time to take all of them. If we have a second round, I will do it. But I wanted to ask her about to what extent she thinks, or you think, Sophia, that the COVID crisis has given rise to a change in the narrative. I mean, in many European countries, before the crisis, we had a lively public and policy debate due to the low farm gate prices. We had demonstrations of farmers all across Europe, the imbalances along the food value chain. I have the impression that this debate has been totally erased by the COVID crisis, so that even the big players of the food chain that went before, had a defensive role because they were the target of many criticisms. But now they are arguing that they have been willing to feed the population in this very complicated crisis. So it seems that this debate about the balances between the farmers, and in particular small and medium farmers, and the big actors in the food chain now has totally disappeared, and there's a new narrative emerging due to the COVID crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Diony. So, Liana, would you like to start with answering?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Again, I hope you can hear me. I'm in a remote area in Scotland, which is a terrific place to be for COVID, but not always so great for internet access. So the three questions that were put to me, I really liked. I particularly liked this first one about new entrants to farming and how we can learn from Africa. I think it's really important, and it's a principle of the SALSA project that we're looking at mutual learning. We're not looking at what Europeans can tell Africans, for instance. So there's definitely things that we can learn. And the two things that come to mind about new entrants in particular is that we have some examples in Africa of using small-scale farms as a micro-business. So there's a very strong European perception of farming, that it's something that should be done on a full-time basis. You should live on the farm. And that's something that requires quite a lot of resources to achieve. So I think something that we can learn from African cases that we're seeing is the opportunity to actually commute out to a piece of land and to treat it as a micro business. So a small scale enterprise that happens to be based on land. I think doing that also helps to deal with some of the stigma that there can be associated with working on land in some European countries. In other European countries, it's a really prestigious sort of thing to do, in the sense of amongst farmers, being a farmer is something that people put a lot of value in, but there are places where that's not the case. So the other thing I think that's important that we're getting from Africa is it's not necessarily important to actually own the land. I mean, to be fair, we've seen a change in the discourse, particularly coming from SAGA, so the European Young Farmer Association, over the last 10 years, where it used to be, please give us government subsidies so that we can buy land. Now they're talking about, please give us subsidies, always, so that we can develop businesses. We don't care how the land is accessed, as long as we have secure, whether we own it or not, as long as we have secure access to it. So I think that's a really important trend in how young farmers in Europe are looking at it, because it will enable them to then invest their resources in developing the business rather than pushing up land markets. The second question had to do with access to credit, and we do have some really good examples coming from SALSA. There's the Latvian Rural Women's Entrepreneurship Support Center that has a microcredit scheme. And how microcredit works is it's just very small amounts of money, and you can do this in a collaborative. So sometimes the traditional, more kind of African example is where women kind of club together, so it tends to be gendered, their resources, and then they take turns loaning that money out to different members of the group. So the amount of money that any individual household might have is very small, but when they put it together, it's enough to give one of them a start. And then once that one has a start, then the money comes back in and it goes out to somebody else. Microcredit's particularly important for women because the diversification activities that they develop on their farms and the investments that they make tend to be much smaller scale. So frankly, too small for your typical, leader programs to bother with in some cases in Europe. And the last question was about getting the government to pay attention to climate issues in relation to small scale farms. That was definitely something that the small scale farmers were concerned about in our studies. So what I mean by that is that our small scale farmers were concerned about climate change, and they were noticing it on their farms, and they were really concerned about it. I think in terms of getting the government to pay attention to anything, it's something that we need a broader push on. And I think something like having a smallholder lens or smallholder proofing policies would be relevant. And that's not just to climate change. I think that's relevant for advisory services, that's relevant for diversification, that's relevant for food regulations, certification schemes, all that sort of thing, that there be a smallholder lens. And if we advocate for something like that, to get government attention across a whole range of issues and normalize smallholders as important players within the food system.
Thank you, Leanne. And then Mark.
Hi. I also hope you can hear me, because like Leanne, I'm sitting in a rather remote rural situation. In my case, 2,500 feet in the Carpathian Mountains. Again, thank you very much for the 3 questions. Regarding the first one, the question of how do food environments, particularly retail, influence small farms and their viability? I mean, I think, speaking very much from a Eastern European perspective, it's not unique to Eastern Europe, but it's actually, of course, happened relatively recently, is that we've seen a retail revolution, particularly the emergence of major large-scale multiple retailers with particularly aggressive policies for positioning themselves in the market. Now, this seems to, it's not a black and white situation. There's clearly a threat. There's clearly both a perceived and a real threat. The retail revolution, the emergence of new retailers has clearly undermined and is undermining both the commercial viability of small-scale production by offering relatively cheap competitive products, but also, and we're seeing this especially here in Romania, is it's also undermining the traditional patterns of self-provisioning and also disrupting the informal networks whereby small farms are connected through family and other connections into the urban areas, etc., etc. So very disruptive. On the other hand, it also offers an opportunity. There are some relatively enlightened companies, and also on a personal store-by-store basis, there are some relatively enlightened store managers who have created very successful and innovative partnerships with small farms, with groups of small farms, with cooperatives of small farms, and are putting a relatively extensive range of good quality fresh produce from those small farms in front of consumers. So very successful, supporting and promoting the financial viability, although there are ongoing issues regarding the balance of power, and of course also providing such opportunities at a local level can also be very disruptive, also in terms of upsetting existing social networks, provide opportunity for one group of small farmers and for not another. So there are issues of inclusion. So that's an interesting question. And then I think there was, yes, a specific issue regarding the success of community-led local development with respect to small farms. I'm certainly not going to present it as a fully tested recommendation, but there are clear examples and good practice examples of the inclusion of small farms and small farming issues and related supply chain issues into local development strategies. Here in Romania, especially, a very large proportion of the local development strategies of the leader groups relate to small farming issues. That's because we have an awful lot of them, 4.5 million of them. Of small farms, that is, not local action groups. Also, what's very interesting to observe is that we now, as I mentioned in the presentation, this kind of lighter, more flexible concept of smart villages. The work that we've been doing here in Romania and elsewhere, looking at the rolling out of a smart village concept, this also is engaging with small farmers as well, because of this digital dimension, because of a social innovation dimension, and certainly where there are clearly defined communities of small farms, community-led local development, is engaging with them. But equally, where there are communities of consumers who are equally looking to engage via alternative food networks, etc., with small farmers, then the CLLD approach also has a lot to offer. And then the third question, seasonality. Yes, the place of seasonality. So I suggested that certainly that there was potential to unlock public procurement as a very positive mechanism and a very clear policy intervention, particularly at a local and a regional level. There was potential to use public procurement for supporting small farms. Now, again, I think it's a complex issue. But clearly, seasonality, if I understand the question correctly, seasonality is a potential obstacle to connecting small farms with public procurement, with public catering institutions. They're not comfortable bedfellows. There are issues with respect to the volume of supply, to the consistency of supply, to the diversity of supply. Now, the indications are that those obstacles can be overcome, but they do need clear strategic intervention. They need a very, very high level of coordination, and also, of course, very high levels of cooperation. Cooperation in providing the necessary aggregation of products, and also cooperation regarding providing the diversity of products that can go some way to addressing the seasonality issue. I really hope that answered the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Before giving the word to Sophia, I think Dionisio wanted to intervene.
Yes, very rapidly, because we had a couple of questions, particularly addressing the COVID issue. So I want Sophia to try to respond to them. The first, apart of the one I made, but the first new question is, to what extent it is realistic to expect social transfer in favor of small farms in a post-pandemic Europe facing a deep recession? And the second one is, if COVID-19 really changed the social perception of the important role of small farms, what is the role that extension services can play in this change? There are two questions that have been made by the participants, so I wanted to share with Sophia before her intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dionisio. Then Sophia, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Don't expect very much from me. All you are reading all the time, how all medical people in the world, all biologists work on this virus, and they will tell you, oh, it's too short time to give you conclusions. So don't expect from me conclusions, but I'll try to answer the questions. The first one is really in principle. We have now an emerging priority, and it is an emerging priority and crisis, not because of dairy prices or beef prices or lack of workers to collect the harvest in fruit and veg. It is a different crisis, and that's why the narrative has changed. What I'm afraid of is this change in narrative, or how I finish with the big tendency that countries may reconsider the globalization of food chain. This will be a reconsideration of trade relations and the role of trade, international trade. And there are many economists, I think, around today, and among the speakers and panelists, we believe in trade. So this COVID pandemic in a world scale may bring a new wave of protectionism, which is really dangerous. My second thing about the first question still is, what the pandemic showed is that production is the problem. It's not the problem. The problem is the logistic. The problem is how to move the production from farms to retail and close retail to people. So probably we all who are trying to research or to see the policies for small farmers and farming post the pandemic, we need to think much more, not on production, but on these links along the food chain. The other two questions are, yes, small farmers were important during the COVID pandemic, but they were mainly important for themselves and for the locality. I also live very rural in a hamlet, it's even not a village in England, and we have a very small farm and farm shop. And this farm shop flourished during the pandemic. because they have local contracts with meat suppliers, with egg suppliers. They produce their fruit and vegetables, and they saw a lot more customers. Whether after, in normal times, the politicians will think this is important, or they will try again to support or design policies that can be in favor of large farms, I can't tell this. But I think the public, and the public is very important, and this is the next question, about advice we give, about attention we give. I think the public started realizing that in such situations, the local producers, the local small food chain is very important. So my hope is, yes, there will be a bit more interest in small farmers, but whether they will manage to change the big policies, I have, unfortunately, a big question mark. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophia. So you opened, not only answered, but you opened a lot of questions. And actually, I think that this research has been really a start, because as Dionisio was saying, that we are starting a new narrative, overcoming the dilemma small, big, but started to reflect in different ways, for example, to diversity and to the impact of diversity. And Sophia showed, for example, that diversity is a key to resilience, and it was clear here, diversification was a key to resilience. At the same time, we see that small farms struggle for existence. So to have access to land, to have access to markets, to have access to knowledge, to extension services. And one of the keys for this new role of small farmers is in their relations. So relations with the market, the relation among themselves, and capacity to build something collective also at the rural level. And on this regard, the issue of smart, which also implies this digitalization, will be related to the capacity of small farmers to organize their diversity and to align them towards societal challenges. So I think that this final conference of SALSA was really very interesting also for myself. I think that I learned a lot also today. But I hope that all participants have enjoyed it. So I would like to thank them all. But at the same time, I would like to thank the panelists, all panelists, because they did a very, very good job. And all the people, the moderators that were able to filter a lot of text and a lot of questions into very precise and clear questions. But also I would like to thank the organizers of these workshops, and mainly the FAO people, Nevena Alexandrova, first of all, but also Cristiano Consolini and Giulia Palestrini, who have been really behind the scenes, but doing a tremendous job. So before closing, I know that I was not told about this, but I would like to give back the word to Teresa, our coordinator, to greet everyone, and at the same time ask everyone to turn their camera so we can have, let's say, a group picture. Teresa, please.
Thanks very much, Gianluca, and thanks for reminding me that we should turn on our camera so that participants can see us at the end. We are all there in real. We are not just online or virtual persons. Oops, sorry. And then I would like to thank all the participants for being with us. We are very aware that this was very short. It was a 4-year project with a lot of work and a lot of data being produced, a lot of knowledge created. So it's very short to present it in 2.5 hours. We were looking forward to have a presential final conference and to have some presential discussions. It was not possible. We still hope we will make a conference about SALSA next year. It will be announced for all those who participated now. Maybe some of you will be able to join. But anyway, there are channels you can access the information. There's a lot of reports. For those more interested in the scientific part, we are preparing a special issue in the journal Global Food Security. So some papers are already accepted, others will come. So the information is out there. Just contact us and we will be happy to provide more information. But for now, it's just really thanks to everyone for being here. And I will ask the participants to stay a bit more so that we take this group photo. I don't know who can take that, but some of us can. Maria can, I'm sure. Thank you very much. I think we close with this.
Thank you very much. So we are closing. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And virtual applause.
Virtual applause, yeah. Okay. Maria, can you take the photo?
I think it should be FAO who should show all the faces together, because right now I can only see a few, so I cannot take the picture. I don't know if Julia can.
I think Cristiano is not here. Julia?
I don't know how the picture is taken.
Mark could
okay,
be.
Now, okay, I think I could take a snapshot.
I mean, this is a bit new to us as well.
Hey, maybe a snapshot, yeah. Oops. Okay.
The only thing is that I have the chat opening up and on Julia's face app now.
Okay.
Okay, it's fine with me, don't worry. Very fine with me.
I got the picture.
I took one as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Got it.
Thank you very much and see you soon. Then.
Thank you, everybody. Well done.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for your cooperation. Hope
Thank
to
you,
see
Teresa.
you live soon. Somewhere.
Hopefully.
For sure.
Hopefully.
Ciao, ciao.
Okay, ciao.
Ciao.
Oof. Yeah. Are the participants still there or it's only us? I don't know.
49.
49 are still there. Okay.